The sun was a sinking ember in the western sky, casting fiery streaks of orange and red across the endless expanse of the Badlands. Ellie tightened her grip on the steering wheel, the asphalt ahead stretching endlessly into the desolation. There wasn't another car in sight, and the gas station she had passed an hour ago had been the last hint of civilization. Her phone had lost signal ages back. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 6:47 p.m. It would be dark soon. Her hands were clammy, and the gnawing unease that had crept in since she'd turned onto this lonely highway now felt like an unwanted passenger. She told herself she was fine. She was on the way to meet friends at a remote Airbnb for a long weekend getaway. The directions had warned her that the route was isolated, but isolation in the middle of nowhere had a gravity that city folk never truly understood until they were in it. Ellie rolled her window down, letting in the cool air and the faint, earthy smell of dust and sagebrush. She turned up the volume on the radio, static hissing faintly before it caught a signal. The sound tinny and distant, as if it were broadcasting from another dimension. The music sputtered, then cut out entirely, replaced by an unsettling silence. A moment later, the car jerked violently. Ellie yelped, pulling over instinctively. Her heart pounded as she turned off the engine, like stepping out to investigate. She rounded the vehicle and crouched down. A shredded tire. The rubber was torn to ribbons, as if something sharp had sliced through it. But there hadn't been debris or potholes, just pristine, endless blacktop. Her stomach churned. She opened the trunk and retrieved the spare tire and jack, muttering to herself to calm her nerves. She'd done this before, but something about the utter quiet, the oppressive stillness of the Badlands, turned the simple task into an ordeal. The wind whistled low across the plains, and the sky dimmed by the second. She tried to focus, but her hands shook as she loosened the lug nuts. The sooner she got back on the road, the better. Ellie froze mid-motion. A sound reached her ears, soft but unmistakable, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Her breath hitched as she scanned the surroundings, seeing nothing but barren fields and the faint outline of a distant ridge. Tap, tap, tap. It grew louder, sharper. It sounded like footsteps. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking. She straightened, clutching the tire iron like a lifeline. The tapping stopped, the stillness returned, heavy and impenetrable. She waited a moment longer, her heart thudding in her chest, then shook her head and resumed working. "Just the wind," she whispered, though it felt like a lie. The moment she tightened the last bolt on the spare, the tapping started again, this time closer. She spun around. Nothing. Just the wind teasing the tall grasses. Her mind raced, adrenaline surging. Without hesitation, Ellie shoved the tools back into the trunk and slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors. The car sputtered but didn't start. She turned the key again, panic blooming in her chest. Nothing. "Come on," she hissed, slamming her palm against the steering wheel. On the third try, the engine roared to life, and she sped off, gravel spitting from under the tires. The road seemed endless. Shadows spilled across the landscape, swallowing the world in darkness. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, chasing her. There was nothing, just her own pale reflection, wide-eyed and trembling. But then she saw it. In the distance, a faint glimmer of light. Relief washed over her. A house, maybe, or a farmstead. It didn't matter. Any place with people would do. She pressed harder on the gas, the car rattling over the uneven road. The light grew brighter as she approached, revealing a weathered signpost leaning crookedly by the roadside. Dry Creek Rest Stop. Established 1962. Ellie frowned. A rest stop? Out here? She pulled into the gravel lot, her headlights illuminating a squat, concrete building with faded paint and boarded-up windows. The glowing light she had seen was an old neon sign buzzing faintly above the entrance, casting an eerie green hue. Ellie hesitated. The place looked abandoned, but maybe there was a payphone inside, or at least some shelter until she could figure out what to do. She stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching underfoot. The air felt heavier here, carrying an electric tension that made her skin prickle. Inside, the rest stop was worse than she imagined. The tiles were cracked, and the walls were stained with what looked like ancient water damage. A single flickering bulb swung lazily overhead, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move on their own. The faint scent of mildew and something metallic hung in the air. She scanned the room. No payphone, just a row of decayed vending machines and a door leading to the restrooms. Something about the space felt wrong, like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Her eyes landed on a dark smear trailing across the floor. It led to the restroom door, which was slightly ajar. She took a step back, every instinct screaming at her to leave. Then she heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was coming from behind the restroom door. Is someone there? Ellie's voice wavered. No response. Her breath quickened as she edged toward the door, pushing it open with trembling fingers. The light flickered, casting brief flashes of illumination over cracked sinks and shattered mirrors. She stepped inside, heart hammering in her chest. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, behind her, a whisper. You shouldn't have come here. Ellie spun around, but the room was empty. The door slammed shut, and the lights went out, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for her phone, but the flashlight wouldn't turn on. The air grew colder, pressing in around her like unseen hands. A low growl rumbled from the shadows, deep and guttural, vibrating through her bones. And then she saw them. Glinting eyes in the darkness, dozens of them, staring at her from every corner of the room. She stumbled backward, her scream catching in her throat. The growl grew louder, and the shadows moved, converging on her. The last thing Ellie saw was her reflection in a broken mirror, wide-eyed and frozen, before the darkness consumed her. The next morning, a passing trucker spotted her car still parked outside the rest stop. The engine was cold and the driver's seat was empty. The trucker glanced toward the building where the neon sign still buzzed faintly, its green glow flickering in the dawn light. He didn't bother going inside. Locals knew better than to stop at Dry Creek. The moon hung low over the horizon, its pale glow barely penetrating the oppressive darkness of the forest. Kevin and Melissa were deep into the mountains, far from cell service, far from anyone who could hear them scream. Their GPS had led them astray hours ago, and the once promising hiking trail had faded into a tangle of unmarked paths. Now they were lost, and night was closing in. We should have turned back earlier, Melissa whispered, her voice shaky. She gripped her flashlight tightly, its weak beam trembling over gnarled roots and thick underbrush. Every rustle, every distant snap of a twig made her flinch. We'll be fine, Kevin replied, though his tone betrayed his own unease. He held a map in one hand, turning it this way and that, but the crinkled paper offered no answers. We just need to keep moving downhill. The trail's gotta be close. But the forest felt alive in the worst way. Shadows shifted, trees loomed like sentinels, and the wind carried faint whispers that seemed to mock them. Melissa glanced over her shoulder for the 100th time, her guts screaming that they were being watched. They pressed on, their boots crunching on brittle leaves, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The air grew colder, and the thick scent of damp earth filled their lungs. Then came the sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking, faint at first but growing steadily louder. It echoed through the trees, alien and deliberate. Kevin froze, holding up a hand for silence. Melissa's heart thundered in her chest as the clicking continued, each snap of sound seeming to come from a different direction. "What is that?" she whispered. Kevin shook his head. "I don't know." They stood there, paralyzed, as the clicking grew closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. Kevin gestured for them to keep moving, but Melissa grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Wait," she hissed. "Look." She pointed ahead where something was hanging from a low branch. It swayed slightly in the breeze, pale and glistening in the faint moonlight. Kevin stepped closer, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. It was a deer, or at least it had been. The animal's body was grotesquely twisted, its limbs bent at impossible angles, its head missing entirely. Its ribs jutted out like jagged teeth, and a dark, viscous liquid dripped onto the forest floor. Melissa gagged, covering her mouth. Kevin staggered back, his flashlight trembling. "What the hell?" The clicking returned, louder this time and accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Melissa grabbed Kevin's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to go. Now." They turned and ran, the beam of Kevin's flashlight bouncing wildly as they crashed through the underbrush. The clicking followed, relentless, accompanied by heavy footsteps that didn't sound human. Whatever was chasing them wasn't far behind. Kevin shouted, "Over there!" He pointed to a faint glimmer of light through the trees. Melissa didn't think twice. She sprinted toward it, her lungs burning, branches clawing at her clothes and skin. They burst into a clearing, stumbling to a halt. In the center stood a small cabin, its windows glowing faintly with flickering candlelight. It looked ancient, its wooden walls weathered and warped. But it was shelter, and at that moment, it was their only hope. Kevin pounded on the door. "Hello, is anyone in there? Please, we need help." No answer. The forest was silent again, the oppressive quiet somehow worse than the chase. Kevin tried the doorknob. It turned easily, and the door creaked open. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by a single lantern on a wooden table. The air was thick with the scent of decay. Melissa hesitated on the threshold, her instincts screaming at her to stay outside, but Kevin pulled her in and slammed the door shut. "We just need to wait it out," he said, his voice trembling. "Whatever's out there, it won't come in here." But as Melissa's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed the markings. Symbols carved into the walls, crude and violent, spiraling in strange, unreadable patterns. The floor was littered with bones, animal, she hoped, though some looked disturbingly human. "Kevin," she began, but he was already backing toward the table, his attention drawn to a strange object resting on it. It was a mask, crudely fashioned from leather and bone, with deep-set eye holes that seemed to stare back at him. He reached for it, as if in a trance. "Don't touch it," Melissa cried, but it was too late. The moment his fingers brushed the mask, the cabin seemed to exhale. The air grew impossibly cold, and the lantern flickered violently. A deep, inhuman groan rumbled from the walls. Kevin dropped the mask, stumbling back. The cabin shook, and the symbols carved into the wood began to glow with a sickly green light. The door slammed shut on its own, and a shadowy figure began to take shape in the corner of the room. It was tall, impossibly so, its limbs long and spindly. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a swirling void, shifting and writhing as if it couldn't decide on a form. The clicking noise returned, emanating from deep within its chest. Melissa screamed, grabbing Kevin's arm. "We have to get out!" The shadow lunged, its elongated fingers stretching toward them. Kevin shoved Melissa toward the door, and together they slammed against it, the old wood splintering under their weight. The creature let out a shriek, a sound so piercing it made their ears bleed. The door burst open, and they tumbled out into the night. They didn't look back as they ran, the forest blurring around them. The clicking sound faded, but they didn't stop until they reached the dirt road where their car was parked. They scrambled inside, and Kevin fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The engine roared to life, and they sped away, leaving the forest and whatever was in that cabin behind. To this day, neither of them can explain what they saw. But sometimes, late at night, Melissa swears she hears it again, that soft rhythmic clicking echoing in the dark. The storm rolled in faster than anyone had predicted, and Ethan's old truck sputtered and groaned as it crawled along the desolate dirt road. Rain hammered the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. He cursed under his breath, leaning forward to peer through the downpour. He'd been delivering supplies to a remote campsite deep in the mountains, but the storm had caught him off guard. Now, with the fuel gauge hovering just above empty, he knew he wouldn't make it back to town. A fork in the road appeared, barely visible through the rain. One path continued into the woods, the other led toward a faint glow in the distance. Ethan hesitated, then turned toward the light. He didn't have many options. The glow turned out to be a gas station, or at least what had once been a gas station. The sign above the building was weathered and cracked, its neon letters flickering erratically. Haven's End Gas and Diner was barely legible. 2 rusted pumps stood like sentinels out front, and a single dim bulb illuminated the entrance. Ethan pulled up under the overhang, killed the engine, and stepped out into the rain. The air was thick with the smell of wet asphalt and something faintly metallic. He glanced around. The place looked abandoned, but the light inside suggested otherwise. He pushed open the glass door, which jingled with a bell that sounded oddly distorted, like it was coming from underwater. Inside, the diner portion of the building was eerily pristine, despite the dilapidated exterior. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and the checkerboard floor gleamed as though freshly polished. A faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. "Hello?" Ethan called out, his voice echoing. No response. He walked to the counter, where a half-filled coffee cup sat next to an open newspaper. The paper was dated July 17th, 1974. Ethan frowned. It was impossible. The edges weren't yellowed, and the ink hadn't smudged. A low creak sounded from the back of the diner. He turned sharply, his pulse quickening. "Anyone here?" he asked again, louder this time. The creak came again, followed by faint footsteps. They didn't sound hurried, just deliberate, as though whoever it was knew Ethan couldn't leave. He backed away, his eyes darting to the door, but something stopped him cold. Through the glass, his truck was gone. The spot where it had been was empty, the rain-soaked ground undisturbed. "What the hell?" Ethan whispered. He spun around, scanning the diner. The newspaper and coffee cup were gone. The booths, once clean and inviting, now looked weathered and torn. The checkerboard floor was cracked and dirty, weeds sprouting through the tiles. The humming lights began to flicker, casting disjointed shadows. In the far corner of the room, Ethan saw movement, a figure sitting in the last booth, their face obscured by shadow. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice trembling. He approached cautiously, but as he neared, the figure didn't move. It sat unnaturally still, head tilted slightly as though listening. "Who are you?" Ethan demanded. No answer. His breath hitched as he finally reached the booth. The figure wasn't a person at all. It was a mannequin. Its skin was a sickly gray, its empty eyes staring forward, its stiff hands clutching a menu that appeared damp and rotting. Ethan stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. When he looked again, the mannequin was gone. The booth was empty, as if it had never been there. The overhead lights went out, plunging the diner into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the rain pounding on the roof. Then the bell above the door jingled again. He turned toward the entrance. A man stood there, his face partially obscured by the brim of a soaked cowboy hat. His clothes were old-fashioned, caked in mud and something darker. His eyes glinted in the dim light as he stepped inside. "You shouldn't have stopped here," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Ethan backed away. "Look, I just need some gas. My truck, it's gone. I don't." "Your truck's not gone," the man interrupted, his lips curling into a humorless smile. "You just won't find it." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" The man didn't answer. He moved behind the counter, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked on strings. He picked up a metal canister and set it on the counter with a thud. "Take this. Head back the way you came. Don't look behind you. No matter what you hear, no matter what calls your name, don't stop." Ethan stared at him, frozen. The man's eyes were dead, glassy, but they bore into him with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. The bell jingled again. Another figure entered the diner, a woman in a tattered dress, her hair dripping wet, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Her movements were jerky, her head cocking unnaturally to the side. Then another figure entered, and another. They filled the diner, all of them wearing the same grotesque smile, all of them moving with the same eerie stiffness. Ethan grabbed the canister and bolted for the door. The figures didn't follow, but watched him with their lifeless, glassy eyes. Outside, his truck was back, parked exactly where he had left it. The rain had stopped, and the air was suffocatingly still. He jumped in, slamming the door shut and locking it. He didn't even question how the truck started as he sped away, the diner shrinking in the rearview mirror. But as he drove, the road stretched on forever, the trees closing in like walls. A faint voice called his name, soft and pleading, from the back seat. He didn't look. The voice grew louder, more insistent, now mingling with faint laughter and clicking noises. Ethan gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone, and he wasn't getting out. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the small, windswept town of Red Hollow cloaked in shadow. Alyssa tightened her scarf against the biting cold as she trudged down the empty main street. She had come to Red Hollow for solitude, hoping the town's remote location would help her focus on her writing. But tonight, the isolation felt oppressive. She glanced at the cracked storefronts and faded signs, relics of a time when the town was alive. The only sign of activity was the faint flicker of light from Dempsey's General Store, its neon sign buzzing faintly above the door. She wasn't planning to stop, but her phone had been dead for hours, and a creeping sense of unease urged her to be around people, even if it was just the store's aging proprietor. The bell above the door jingled as Alyssa stepped inside. The warm air smelled faintly of mothballs and dust. Mr. Dempsey was at the counter, his head bowed as he flipped through a yellowed ledger. His silver-rimmed glasses glinted in the light of a bare bulb. "Evening," Alyssa said, her voice breaking the stillness. The old man looked up slowly, his face pale and worn. His eyes, milky with cataracts, seemed to peer past her. "You shouldn't be out after dark," he said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. Alyssa blinked. "Excuse me?" He didn't repeat himself. Instead, he nodded toward a corner of the store where shelves of canned goods stood crookedly under the weight of decades. Stock up. Leave by first light. She chuckled nervously. I've got supplies. Just wanted to check in, I guess. Not many people around. Dempsey frowned. Not many left, he muttered, more to himself than to her. Then, louder, stay inside tonight. Whatever you do, don't open the door. Alyssa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She offered an awkward thanks and stepped back into the street, the bell jingling behind her. The cold night air felt sharper now. She glanced toward the end of the street where her rental cabin lay at the edge of the woods. It had seemed quaint and charming when she'd booked it online, but now it loomed in the distance like a black hole. By the time she reached the cabin, darkness had fully settled. The porch light flickered weakly as she fumbled with the keys. Once inside, she locked the door, slid the deadbolt, and drew the curtains tight. The cabin was cozy but sparse, its wood-paneled walls adorned with faded photographs of stern-faced pioneers. She set her laptop on the kitchen table and made herself tea, trying to shake the weight of Dempsey's words. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Alyssa turned on the radio, hoping for some background noise, but only static filled the airwaves. She flipped it off and pulled out her notebook, staring at the blank page. A soft knock interrupted the silence. She froze, the pen hovering in her hand. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable. Someone was at the door. Her heart raced. She hadn't seen anyone else on her way back from the store, and the cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor. She stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor, and approached the door. "Hello," she called out. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time, a sharp, deliberate rap of knuckles against wood. Alyssa's stomach turned. Against her better judgment, she pulled the curtain aside to peer through the window. The porch was empty. She let the curtain drop and stepped back, her pulse pounding in her ears. The knock came again, insistent and closer, as though it wasn't coming from the door, but from inside the house. She spun around, scanning the room. Everything was as it had been. Her laptop on the table, her teacup on the counter, but the shadows seemed deeper, more alive. And then she saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the hallway where the darkness swallowed the light. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted slowly to one side, as though studying her. Alyssa stumbled back, her breath hitching. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. As it emerged into the faint light of the kitchen, Alyssa saw its face, or lack of one. Its skin was featureless, smooth, and pale, as if stretched too tightly over its skull. Where its eyes should have been were empty hollows, blacker than the surrounding night. She screamed, bolting for the door. Her fingers fumbled with the lock as the creature moved closer, its footsteps eerily silent. She yanked the door open and ran into the night, her bare feet slipping on the icy ground. The woods loomed ahead, dark and endless, but she had no other choice. Branches clawed at her as she plunged into the trees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The wind carried faint whispers, like voices just out of earshot. She tripped on a root and fell hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. For a moment, she lay there, dazed as the world spun around her. Then she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. Laughter. Low, guttural, and impossibly close. Alyssa scrambled to her feet, but the creature was already there, its long, spindly arms reaching for her, its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief, horrifying moment she felt her mind unravel, as though it were pulling her very thoughts into the void of its gaze. She screamed again, but no sound came. The last thing she saw was the smooth, featureless face leaning closer, its hollow mouth stretching wide in a soundless howl. The next morning, the sheriff found her car parked outside the cabin. The door was open, her belongings untouched. There were no footprints leading into the woods, no sign of a struggle. Inside, the only trace of her was her notebook, left open on the kitchen table. The page was filled with a single sentence, scrawled over and over in jagged, desperate handwriting. It watches. It waits. The road stretched endlessly before Jenna, a narrow strip of asphalt, cutting through miles of desolate plains. Her GPS had failed hours ago, her phone signal was gone, and the last gas station she passed had been shuttered and overgrown with weeds. The setting sun painted the horizon a deep orange, but the encroaching darkness felt heavy, almost suffocating. Her headlights pierced the gathering gloom, but even they seemed dimmer than usual, as if the night itself were swallowing the light. She cursed herself for taking the shortcut. The highway might have been longer, but at least it wasn't this isolated. As the sun finally disappeared, she spotted something ahead. Relief washed over her when she saw the faint glow of a building's lights. A motel, standing alone in the vast emptiness, its flickering neon sign reading, "Pinewood Rest, Vacancy." Jenna pulled into the gravel parking lot. The building looked old, but functional, a two-story structure with a long row of rooms and a tiny office in the center. A lone car was parked at the far end, its windows fogged over. She grabbed her overnight bag and headed for the office, her boots crunching on the gravel. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The interior smelled faintly of mildew, and the air was heavy with silence. Behind the counter sat a man in his late 50s, his thinning hair slicked back and his smile strained. "Evening," he said, his voice flat. "Looking for a room?" "Yeah," Jenna replied, her nerves prickling. Something about the man's glassy stare unsettled her, but she was too tired to dwell on it. He slid a key across the counter. "Room 6, end of the row. Don't go wandering." Jenna frowned. "Why would I wander?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he picked up an old radio from under the counter and turned it on. Static crackled faintly as he adjusted the dial, but no station came through. He didn't seem to notice. "Thanks," Jenna muttered, grabbing the key and heading back outside. The night air was colder now, biting at her skin as she walked to her room. The fluorescent bulbs above each door buzzed faintly, their light casting harsh shadows. Room 6 was at the very end of the row, its door slightly ajar. Jenna hesitated, her grip tightening on the key. She hadn't opened it yet. "Hello?" she called out, nudging the door open with her foot. The room was empty. A single bed with a lumpy mattress sat against the far wall, flanked by a nightstand and a dusty lamp. A small TV sat on a dresser, its screen dark and slightly cracked. The bathroom door was closed, and the air smelled faintly of damp wood. She shut the door firmly behind her and locked it. Tossing her bag onto the bed, Jenna tried the TV, but it only displayed static. Sighing, she turned it off and pulled out her laptop, hoping to write for a bit. But the screen flickered as it powered on, and the battery, which had been at 80%, suddenly drained to 0. "Great," she muttered, slamming it shut. A faint creak came from the bathroom. Jenna froze, her pulse quickening. "Is someone in there?" No response. She crept toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. Slowly, she pushed it open. The bathroom was empty. A small, grimy mirror hung above the sink, and the shower curtain was half drawn, revealing a stained tub. Her reflection in the mirror looked wrong. At first, she thought it was the poor lighting, but the longer she stared, the more she realized it wasn't just a trick of the light. Her reflection didn't match her movements. It lagged just slightly, like an old film reel missing frames. She turned away quickly, her stomach churning, and closed the bathroom door. A low, rhythmic tapping sound began, faint but distinct. It wasn't coming from the bathroom, it was coming from the window. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued, slow and deliberate, as though someone or something was testing the glass. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The tapping stopped. Gathering her courage, she approached the window and pulled the curtain aside. Nothing was there. Just the gravel parking lot, stretching into darkness. The lone car at the other end was gone. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the air in the room grew heavy, oppressive. A low hum filled her ears, making it hard to think. She staggered back, her eyes darting around the room. The mirror in the bathroom shattered, the sound sharp and violent. Jenna spun toward the door, but before she could move, the TV turned on by itself, filling the room with blinding white static. The static wasn't random. Shapes moved within it, twisting, writhing, forming something that looked almost human, but wasn't. A voice crackled through the speakers, distorted and guttural. "Why? Did you stop?" Jenna screamed, yanking open the door and running into the night. The motel was dark now, its neon sign extinguished. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine to roar to life. She sped down the road, blanked on the motel disappearing in her rearview mirror. Relief washed over her as she put distance between herself and the cursed place. But as she glanced in the mirror, her blood turned to ice. The reflection wasn't hers. It was smiling. The rain was relentless, hammering the windshield as Mark navigated the twisting mountain road. The drive had been harrowing, the narrow lanes slick with water and bordered by steep drop-offs into the forested abyss below. His phone was dead, his GPS long since useless in this remote part of the country. The only thing keeping him on course was a hand-drawn map given to him by the gas station attendant an hour back, a map that now sat crumpled on the passenger's seat. He was heading to Raven Creek Lodge, a secluded cabin his friend had inherited and invited him to stay at for a weekend getaway. But now, with the storm growing fiercer and the road seemingly endless, doubt gnawed at him. A sign loomed ahead, barely illuminated by his dimming headlights. Raven Creek, 3 miles. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. A sharp bend in the road came too quickly, and the truck's tires skidded on the slick asphalt. Mark wrestled the wheel, the truck careening dangerously close to the edge, before finally coming to a shuddering halt. Breathing heavily, he checked himself for injuries. Shaken but unharmed, he opened the door to inspect the damage. The rain was ice cold, drenching him instantly. The front tire was flat, and the truck leaned precariously toward the drop-off. "Great," he muttered, kicking the tire in frustration. There was no way to fix it in this weather, and the thought of staying in the truck all night was unbearable. Grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment, he decided to walk. If the lodge was only 3 miles away, he could make it there and return for the truck in the morning. The forest swallowed him quickly, the road disappearing behind a curtain of rain and shadows. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the towering trees that loomed like silent sentinels. The sound of the rain was deafening, but it wasn't enough to drown out the faint, rhythmic crunch of his boots on the gravel. About a mile in, Mark began to feel off. The forest felt unnaturally still despite the storm. The air was thick, oppressive, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He paused, shining the flashlight in every direction. The beam caught nothing but trees and the shifting shadows cast by the rain. He pressed on, his pace quickening. The road narrowed further, the forest closing in tightly. The flashlight's beam flickered, and Mark cursed under his breath. He slapped it against his palm, the light sputtering before flaring back to life. That was when he saw it, a figure standing just ahead, partially obscured by the rain. "Hey!" Mark called out, relief flooding him. "Do you know if this road leads to Raven Creek Lodge?" The figure didn't respond. It stood motionless, its silhouette distorted by the rain. Something about its posture wasn't right, too rigid, too unnatural. Mark's heart began to pound. He took a cautious step forward, shining the flashlight directly at the figure. It was gone. Just gone. A chill ran down his spine. He scanned the road, the trees, the shadows, but there was no sign of anyone. "You're just tired," he muttered to himself. "The rain's messing with your eyes." But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. He could feel it, something just beyond the edge of the light, keeping pace with him, lurking in the shadows. The crunch of gravel under his boots was no longer the only sound. Another set of footsteps echoed his own, faint and uneven, like someone limping. Mark broke into a jog, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. The footsteps quickened to match his pace. He didn't dare look back. Up ahead, he saw it. A faint light through the trees. The lodge. Relief surged through him, and he sprinted the last few yards, bursting out of the forest and into the clearing where the lodge stood. It was larger than he'd expected, its dark wooden exterior illuminated by a single lantern hanging on the porch. The windows were dark, the building eerily quiet. He pounded up the steps and tried the door. It was unlocked. "Hello?" he called, stepping inside. The interior was cold, the air stale. The lodge smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. "Mike?" he called again, his voice echoing through the empty space. The flashlight's beam swept across the living room, a sagging couch, a cold fireplace, and a grandfather clock that had stopped at 3:15. A door creaked open somewhere deeper in the lodge, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. "Mike, this isn't funny," Mark said, his voice trembling. The door creaked again, and the faint sound of whispering began, indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. He followed the noise down a narrow hallway, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The whispering grew louder, leading him to a door at the end of the hall. His hand shook as he turned the knob. The door swung open, revealing a bedroom lit by a flickering candle. The bed was neatly made, but something was wrong. The shadows in the room didn't move with the flickering light. They twisted unnaturally, forming shapes that seemed almost human. Mark stepped back, his heart racing. That was when he saw it, the mirror above the dresser. It reflected not the room, but the forest outside. And in the forest, dozens of figures stood motionless, their faces blank, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. The whispering grew deafening, the voices overlapping into a cacophony of despair. Mark turned to run, but the hallway was gone. The lodge was gone. He was back in the forest, the rain pouring harder than ever. And they were there, dozens of them. Figures standing in the shadows, their blank faces turned toward him. They stepped closer, their movements jerky, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. Mark ran. He didn't stop, didn't look back. The whispering followed him, growing louder, more desperate. When he finally reached the road, his truck was still there, but the tires were slashed, the windows shattered. The last thing he saw as he turned to face the forest was the reflection of his own terrified face in the glass of the truck's side mirror. Behind him, in the darkness, a figure smiled. The desert stretched endlessly around Leah, a vast expanse of red sand and jagged rocks illuminated by the cold light of a full moon. She regretted taking the back roads, but the highway had been clogged with traffic, and she had wanted to save time. Now her car sat dead on the side of the road, refusing to start, and there wasn't a soul in sight. The wind howled, kicking up dust and rattling the bushes. Leah checked her phone again. Still no signal. She grabbed her flashlight and a bottle of water, deciding her best option was to walk. The map on her dashboard had shown a gas station about 5 miles up the road. She could make it before dawn if she hurried. The night was eerily silent except for the crunch of her boots on the cracked asphalt. The road seemed to stretch forever, a ribbon of darkness flanked by shadowy dunes. Occasionally she thought she saw movement in her periphery, a quick, darting motion. But whenever she turned, there was nothing, just empty desert. An hour passed, maybe 2. Leah's legs ached, and her throat was dry despite the water. The gas station felt farther away than it should have been. She glanced back and realized her car was no longer visible. The road behind her was swallowed by darkness, and the thought of how far she'd come filled her with dread. That was when she saw the lights. At first, she thought it was the gas station, like a faint glow on the horizon. But as she walked closer, she realized the lights weren't stationary. They floated, weaving gently through the air like fireflies. Her steps slowed. The lights were strange, too large for insects, too erratic for headlights. They hovered above the road, pulsing faintly, their color shifting between pale blue and sickly green. A low hum accompanied them, vibrating in her chest. Leah stopped walking, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The lights seemed to notice her. They drew closer, moving in deliberate serpentine motions. "Hello?" she called out, her voice small in the vast emptiness. The lights stopped, hovering about 20 feet away. She could see them more clearly now, translucent orbs, their surfaces shimmering like oil on water. Inside each orb, faint shapes shifted, too indistinct to identify, but unsettling in their movement. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. One of the orbs began to pulse faster, brighter, as it floated toward her. The hum grew louder, a bone-deep vibration that made her teeth ache. "No," Leah whispered, backing away. The orb followed, closing the distance between them. Her flashlight flickered, then went out entirely. Panicking, she turned and ran. The orbs gave chase, their hum rising into a shrill, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ground beneath her felt unstable, like the desert itself was shifting. She tripped, falling hard onto the rough asphalt. Pain shot through her palms as she scrambled to her feet, but the lights were already on her. They circled her, moving so quickly they became a blur. The sound was deafening now, a cacophony of high-pitched screeches and low, guttural growls. In the chaos, Leah caught glimpses of something inside the lights. Faces, twisted, anguished faces pressing against the surface of the orbs, mouths open in silent screams. She gasped, stumbling backward, but there was nowhere to go. The largest orb descended, hovering inches from her face. Its light was blinding, forcing her to close her eyes. She felt a searing heat followed by an intense cold that made her gasp. And then, nothing. When Leah woke, the sun was rising. She was lying in the middle of the road, her body stiff and covered in fine red dust. Her water bottle was empty, her flashlight cracked and useless. Her car was nowhere in sight. She stumbled to her feet, her head pounding. The desert around her was quiet, but something felt wrong. She looked down at her hands and froze. Her palms were covered in strange, intricate patterns, like scars or tattoos, glowing faintly in the morning light. The patterns seemed to shift and writhe under her skin, forming symbols she couldn't understand. Far in the distance, a new sound reached her ears, a hum, faint but growing louder. Leah turned and began to run. The old coastal road was empty, flanked by jagged cliffs on one side and a restless ocean on the other. Mia's car hummed steadily as she drove, the headlights cutting through the thick fog that had rolled in from the sea. She checked the clock on the dashboard. 1:13 a.m. She was late, so late. Her sister had begged her not to take this route. Stories of accidents, vanishings, and strange occurrences surrounded this stretch of road, but Mia hadn't listened. It was the quickest way home, and she couldn't afford to miss her flight in the morning. The fog grew thicker, almost swallowing the light from her high beams. The road, usually visible at least a few feet ahead, now seemed to appear only at the last second, each curve a blind guess. She slowed down, her knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. That was when she saw it. A figure in the road, shrouded in mist, illuminated only for a moment before her headlights passed over it. Mia's breath caught in her throat as she swerved, narrowly avoiding the figure. Her tires screeched on the wet asphalt, and the car skidded to a halt. Heart pounding, she looked back. The figure stood still about 20 feet away, a dark silhouette against the glowing fog. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, thin limbs and a head tilted at an unnatural angle. Mia's first instinct was to drive away, but something about the figure held her gaze. She couldn't explain it, an unnatural pull like gravity, but worse. She turned off her headlights, hoping the darkness would obscure it, but the figure didn't disappear. If anything, it grew clearer. Its skin was a pale ashen gray, and its eyes glowed faintly, pinpricks of white light in a featureless face. A soft tapping on her window made her scream. She whipped her head around. Nothing. Just fog and her own distorted reflection in the glass. When she turned back toward the road, the figure was closer. Much closer. It hadn't moved, not that she'd seen, but now it was only a few feet away, its glowing eyes fixed on her. Mia slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning as she sped backward down the road. The figure didn't move, but it didn't fade into the distance either. It stayed right there in front of her, impossibly close despite her accelerating speed. Panic set in. She threw the car into drive, determined to barrel past it. The figure didn't flinch as her car raced forward. Just as she was about to collide with it, it vanished, dissolving into the fog. Mia barely had time to process what happened before the car jolted violently. A loud thud. Thud echoed through the cabin, followed by the sound of grinding metal. She hit the brakes, her car screeching to a halt once again. Her hands shook as she stepped out, the cold sea air biting at her skin. The car's front end had crumpled against something, an old, rusted road sign she hadn't seen in the fog. She cursed under her breath, kicking at the gravel in frustration, but her anger quickly turned to unease. The fog felt heavier now, pressing against her like a living thing. And then she heard it, a faint whisper, like the wind carrying words she couldn't quite make out. She turned, her flashlight sweeping across the road. The beam caught nothing but fog and shadows. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't the wind, it was coming from behind her. Mia spun around, the flashlight shaking in her grip. The figure was there again, standing just beyond the reach of the light. Closer now. Its limbs were longer than before, twisted in grotesque angles, and its glowing eyes were brighter. "No," Mia whispered, backing away. "No, this isn't real." The figure tilted its head, the movement sharp and unnatural. The whispering grew into a low, guttural growl that vibrated in her chest. She turned and ran. The fog seemed to thicken as she sprinted down the road, her flashlight flickering. The growling followed her, louder, closer. She didn't dare look back. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoed behind her, but she couldn't see anything. Her foot caught on something and she fell hard onto the asphalt, the flashlight skittering away. When she scrambled to grab it, the The beam illuminated something on the ground. A row of deep, claw-like scratches gouged into the road. A shadow fell over her and she froze. The figure loomed above her, its limbs impossibly long and its glowing eyes fixed on hers. It crouched, moving closer, its movements jerky and wrong. The whispering returned, now inside her head, the words clear and chilling. "You shouldn't have come," Mia screamed, squeezing her eyes shut. When she opened them, she was back in her car. The engine was running, the fog was gone, and the road ahead was clear. Her hands gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, and her heart felt like it was trying to escape her chest. She drove, not daring to stop, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. When she reached the airport hours later, her sister called. Mia answered shakily, her voice barely steady. "Where were you?" her sister demanded. "I've been trying to reach you all night." "I got lost," Mia said, her voice hollow. "I'm fine now." But as she hung up and caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, she froze. The glowing eyes were there, staring back at her. The small mountain town of Black Hollow was the kind of place that didn't show up on maps. Tucked deep in the woods, it was surrounded by dense pine forests and veiled in perpetual mist. Rebecca hadn't planned on stopping there, but her car's gas gauge had dipped dangerously low, and the last sign had promised a station just a few miles off the highway. As her tires crunched over the gravel road leading into town, she realized something felt wrong. The streets were deserted, the buildings old and sagging. A few dim lights glowed in windows, but no one was outside, not even a stray dog. The gas station sat at the edge of the main road, its neon sign flickering faintly. "Fill and go, open 24/7. She pulled up to the pump and stepped out, the air cold and heavy. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a faint metallic tang. Rebecca glanced toward the station's convenience store. The windows were smeared with grime, and the door creaked open and shut in the wind. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. She sighed and began pumping the gas, her eyes darting around the empty town. It felt like the buildings were watching her, their broken windows like empty sockets. She finished quickly, grabbing her wallet to pay inside. The store's interior was worse than she'd expected. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over the shelves. Dust coated everything, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the air. A clerk sat behind the counter, his head bowed, face obscured by a tattered ball cap. Rebecca approached cautiously. "Hi, I just need to pay for gas. Pump 3. The clerk didn't respond. His head jerked slightly as if he hadn't heard her. She hesitated, then leaned over the counter. "Excuse me?" The man slowly lifted his head. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot and sunken deep into his skull. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words Rebecca couldn't hear. A shiver ran down her spine as she took a step back. I'll just leave the money here," she stammered, pulling a few bills from her wallet. As she placed the money on the counter, the man's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with an iron grip. His fingers were icy cold, his nails dirty and cracked. "You need to leave," he whispered, his voice hoarse and raspy. "Now." Rebecca yanked her arm free and bolted for the door. She didn't stop until she was back in her car, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her breathing was ragged as she fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling. The engine roared to life, and she tore out of the lot, her tires kicking up gravel. As she sped down the road, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The gas station was already swallowed by the fog, but she could swear she saw figures emerging from the shadows, their shapes indistinct and wrong. Rebecca gripped the wheel tightly, her pulse pounding. She just needed to get back to the highway. She'd never been so eager to see streetlights, other cars, anything that would remind her of civilization. The road twisted and turned, the fog growing thicker. Her headlights barely pierced the gloom, and the trees seemed to close in around her. She kept checking her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the clerk or something worse chasing her. Then she saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, directly in her path. She slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. Her heart raced as she stared at the figure through the windshield. It was a woman, dressed in a torn white dress, her hair matted and hanging over her face. Rebecca honked the horn. "Get out of the way," she shouted, but the woman didn't move. The figure slowly raised an arm, pointing toward the woods. The motion was deliberate, almost mechanical. Rebecca's skin crawled, but something compelled her to look. Her headlights illuminated the edge of the forest. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, but beyond them she could see shapes moving. Dozens of them. They were too far to make out clearly, but their movements were jerky and unnatural, like puppets on invisible strings. The woman in the road turned her head toward Rebecca. Her face was pale and blank, her eyes dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth opened, and though no sound came, Rebecca felt it, a scream, raw and piercing, reverberating in her mind. She hit the gas, swerving around the woman and speeding down the road. The scream followed her, growing louder until she thought her head would split open. The fog thickened, and the road seemed endless. No matter how far she drove, the highway never appeared. Her gas gauge, which she just filled, was dropping rapidly, the needle hovering near empty. Panic set in as she realized the landscape wasn't changing. It was the same stretch of road looping endlessly, the same trees, the same fog. Her headlights flickered and the engine sputtered. The car rolled to a stop, dead in the middle of the road. "No, no, no," she whispered, slamming her fist against the wheel. The silence was deafening. Even the wind had stopped. She looked out the window. The woman in white was there, standing just inches away, her blank face pressed against the glass. Rebecca screamed. When search parties found the car weeks later, it was empty, abandoned on the same desolate stretch of road. The gas tank was full, and the keys were still in the ignition. No sign of Rebecca was ever found. But locals say that on foggy nights, if you drive through Black Hollow, you might see her standing in the road, pointing toward the woods. And if you do, don't stop.